Those of you that don't know me, my name's Mike Blackmore. I'm Director of Operations at Wessex Rivers Trust. So I um, run the team that deliver our river restoration and habitat improvement projects. And that includes the Watercress and Winterbournes program, or at least the uh, habitat restoration capital works element of that program. Um, so the habitat restoration program actually started in 2019 when Watercress and Winterbournes was under development, and there was a big mapping exercise to go out and look for opportunities, look at potential problems we could try and solve. And then we moved into a delivery phase in um, in 2020. So that started off with 3 projects being delivered that year. Now, the first of which was a fish passage improvement project at an old sawmill on the Bourne rivulet, trying to get fish up past some historic infrastructure. And the way we approached this was to actually make use of what was already there. So there's quite a big drop from the old mill pond down through what was the old um, mill workings. And we were able to make use of one of the sluices to create a kind of naturalistic anyway, kind of rocky cascade, the sort of thing that fish are kind of evolved to have no real trouble getting past. And the great thing about this kind of project is, I mean, A, it looks very natural. B, it's quite a kind of rough and random um, way of moving water downstream. So it actually works over quite a wide range of flows, and actually kind of engineered technical fish passes actually have a narrower range of operating flows compared to something that's a bit more natural than this. One of the other benefits of something nice and natural like this is that as the flows drop, you actually allow for vegetation to encroach on it a little bit. So it pinches it up and actually retains a good depth and flow of water. So that's been a really effective project, really simple solution, but nonetheless really effective. Another project delivered in 2020 was on the Peel Hill Brook at a place called Penny Marsh. And this was a salmonid spawning um, habitat project, and also involved some measures to reduce sediment getting into the river. So in this case, what was done was to create some sort of offline cattle drinking areas. So somewhere where livestock could still access water, but without having to get actually into the river. And this was delivered with help from the Wild Trout Trust. They've helped with a number of these projects, and this is very much their kind of thing. So you'll see here they've introduced this sort of habitat features, this kind of pool and riffle sequence with a little pinch in the river to keep that scoured clean, and that provides really optimal habitat for trout to spawn in, and introducing some kind of fallen tree kind of analog woody habitat immediately downstream of some of those spawning sites, which provides really good nursery habitat for fry as they emerge from their eggs. And also introducing some nice big chunky woody habitat features, again, just kind of mimicking the sort of habitat that's created when trees naturally fall in the river. And so some of those big chunkier things provide some good cover for adult fish, and that helps to encourage spawning at those locations. The third project delivered that year, also on the Peel Hill Brook, at a property called the Cottage on the Green. Here we had a very overshaded, very overwide section of river, pretty degraded habitat, basically uniformly shallow and wide and very silty. And a combination of letting some light in by felling some trees and then making use of those trees, again, same as before, mimicking that kind of natural fallen tree habitat, but doing it in such a way where we can kind of create a narrow meander sequence within that channel. Um, just meant that we can slightly narrow that up, speed the flows up, provide some depth, and help to scour clean a sort of smaller channel through there. And then with that increased light getting into the channel, we've been able to encourage a lot more marginal plant growth. And again, really good habitat for the fish, but also great habitat for freshwater invertebrates. And then that's good uh, for the birds, for fish, for mammals, for the whole ecosystem. Moving into 2021, we added a few more projects in. Um, One of the most basic, near Gambridge Lane at Stoke on the Bourne Rivulet. Uh, Very typical issue, particularly with Winterbournes in this catchment, in that the Winterbournes are flowing through land that's quite heavily grazed at certain times of the year. And you might think not too much of an issue when there's actually no water in the channel. But what tends to happen is you when the flows return, you get a pulse of fine sediment that flows uh, down the river, and it just makes sense where we can to exclude livestock from at least some sections of the Winterbournes. I'm not going to take the credit for the water being there. That happened on its own. We just we just put up the fence. But really simple habitat that can have quite a significant impact on um, fine sediment inputs into the Winterbourne. Um, on the subject of sediment, this is a slightly more engineered solution. So this is at Dark Lane at Cheriton. This is an engineered um, sediment trap, and there was quite a significant flow pathway running down Dark Lane going into the stream. This is a simple sort of shuttering and poured concrete box essentially with a little drain that feeds into it, and then that gives us something that can be maintained regularly and emptied out. And it just means that so long as it is maintained, we can intercept sediment before it reaches the stream. On the upper test at a place called Flashits, um, there was a habitat project delivered here, quite similar to the project on the Pill Hill Brook. Uniformly very wide, very silty, very overshaded section of river, actually quite publicly accessible as well. So this is one of the few places on the test where the public can have quite good access to the stream. But this is what people are seeing when they get there, is this kind of very shallow, muddy channel, not classic chalk stream habitat. In this case, again with some help with the Wild Trout Trust, but also a good number of volunteers and some of the staff from Wessex Rivers Trust as well, and a couple of contractors. This was like with the cottage on the green, sort of introducing some woody habitat, but also introducing a kind of gravel beach area to help shape the river up a little bit, but also provide some kind of hard standing public access. So somewhere where people can access the river without eroding the riverbank too much. The team worked in all kinds of weathers for this project, and got to use some fancy tools in actually doing some maintenance to the footpath along the river and improving that access. And this is what it looked like afterwards. So by narrowing the channel, it's scoured away a lot of the silt, provided some better depth, again, better spawning habitat, better marginal habitat, good for the invertebrates, good for the fish, uh, birds, mammals, bats, you name it. Finally, for that year, there was a project on the River Arle along the Millennium Way, which is a really popular footpath, pretty much anywhere where you get a footpath that runs along a really nice bit of chalk stream, you're going to get a lot of people and a lot of dogs, and you're going to get problems with erosion. So in this case, project involved some more of that sort of woody habitat, but also an idea that we sort of pinched from Test Valley Borough Council. They've done a lot of this on the River Anton at Andover, which is to put up fencing with a kind of bird netting on it, and it just means that small animals, small birds can get through there, but dogs can't. And it's not too, visually offensive. People can see over it fine, and it just means that we're not getting lots of sort of dogs scrambling all over the bank and causing erosion. That's really important for the river and for controlling fine sediment. We also introduced some formalized dog dips, so some areas where dogs can get into the river, because we don't want to actually exclude people and dogs from the river entirely and stop people enjoying the river. There was a bit of a debate with this project of whether we should have one or two, and we ended up with one. And what we've actually had since is a lot of the gravel has been kind of already eroded out of these steps. So we're actually going to go back later this year with some slightly bigger gravel and some volunteers, and replenish that, and hopefully then it will stay put long term. Moving into 2022, another bumpy year. We started off back on the Pill Hill Brook at Abbott's Ann. This is a stretch running through along a series of gardens. In places, very, very silty. Seems to be a recurrent theme with the chalk stream headwaters. We're getting a lot of fine sediment, a lot of problems with there not being energized flows, and we're getting sort of uniform deposition of silt across the channel. And also, when you're in a garden setting, the first thing you tend to lose is the marginal habitat. As humans, we kind of have this urge to make nice, tidy, clean edges everywhere we go, particularly where we have streams running through gardens. So this was an opportunity to introduce some of that nice sort of squishy marginal habitat, but kind of being in keeping with a garden setting. Another great volunteer project. This was something that involved a lot of elbow grease and hand tools to get the job done. Really good turnout for that project, and I think it was really good fun. Staying with that theme of garden edges, on the Bourne rivulet at St Marybourne, around the back of a string of houses, there's a small lake, and the stream runs alongside that, and we've got some pretty hard engineered revetments along the channel, and it's something that does happen with Winterbournes, because you have such a variation in flow. You do have a period of the year where you get quite a lot of deposition as those flows drop. So what's really important is to try and encourage that to happen in the right places and not have it happening over the gravels kind of mid-channel, where we want to have that as good spawning habitat, and somewhere where freshwater invertebrates, where bugs can get in between the grains of gravel. It's a really important habitat. But you can see here, actually, we're starting to get marginal plants growing in the middle of the channel, which is a sure sign that your channel is been over engineered, is probably too wide. You probably don't have the flow energies that you need. And once you start to get that kind of marginal encroachment, actually, you can end up with a flood risk, particularly when the flows first return. If we haven't had a hard frost and had that vegetation start to peel back, there is a period of the year where you can have increased flood risk, and flood risk is a big concern for the community here. Ironically, sometimes engineering these channels to make them wide and give them a big capacity and lots of conveyance for floodwater flows actually means they spend a lot of the year in this kind of condition, and then you do have that kind of growth of marginal plants mid-channel. So you can, in some cases, actually increase flood risk by trying to widen channels for flood risk. So the solution in this case was to actually reshape the channel, so to create these sort of more sloping margins where we can have those marginal plants growing. But actually what that does is it helps to retain a faster flow through the middle of the channel. And we also had some different types of sort of marginal habitats introduced. So some sort of classic sort of berms, like this structure in the foreground here with some soil in it somewhere, where you'll very quickly get a reed bed sort of established. But also you'll see along the toe of this hard engineered bank, there's a line of pre-planted coir logs, so somewhere we can hopefully get marginal plants growing and just soften up that very hard edge. And at the same time, scraping back some sections of bank, helping to just create a little bit more sinuosity, make this a little bit more natural in its shape and form, and then we get a more natural morphology and a better wildlife habitat. And in some cases, replacing those harder revetments with something which is still a relatively vertical revetment. These projects are a negotiation and a compromise, and in this case, landowner wanted to keep some semblance of that kind of nice, clean garden edge. So that was rebuilt out of more natural materials and something we could plant into, so that we hopefully get a bit more of a balance. One of the great things about this particular project is that the local community got involved in actually growing on some seedlings, so that were then used to plant up the project once it was completed. Over onto the River Anton in Andover. This is an online pond, essentially. See a lot of this kind of landscaping that's happened, particularly in sort of semi-urban areas, where you had at some point a small headwater chalk stream, and someone decided it'd be a good idea to widen that out into a lovely pond. And I'm sure when it was first dug, it probably was quite a nice pond. But when you significantly widen and deepen a channel, you essentially create a giant sediment trap. So over the several decades since that was created, it of course filled in with silt and became a big silty mess that looked like this during the winter. And then in the summer, you just have plants growing kind of all over the place. So again, marginal plants growing in the middle of the channel. You got sort of like pond species going in there, and actually very good water vole habitat here, but definitely not a chalk stream habitat. So this was a really challenging project, because what do you do with something like this? How do you convert that back into a chalk stream? Well, the answer is you need to bring in an awful lot of gravel. You need to kind of put back what was taken away. So fortunately, it being near the perennial head and it being quite a dry year, it did actually dry up. So we were able to get in there and work mostly in the dry, but it's still very, very soft, very squishy, quite a precarious site to be working in. Had to be very, very careful and working around water voles, lots and lots of surveys to identify where they were. there were actually there was a lot of concrete blocks. Um, so the edge of this kind of pond feature was basically lined in concrete blocks. What we actually did in this case was we pulled those out to kind of restore that marginal habitat, and that formed a bit of a sub layer that we were able to then layer gravel over the top of, and that just helped to bring the cost down. When you've got to bring in hundreds and hundreds of tons of gravel, it gets very expensive. Um, and end result was that being able to work in the dry, we're essentially able to create brand new chalk stream essentially from scratch. And then that's started flowing again. And what we're doing now is really just monitoring that as that reestablishes, as it greens up and grows back into a chalk stream. There's a little bit of remediation work to do. We've had a couple of very high flow years, but actually it's developing really nicely. So that's one I think we'll continue to monitor for a good few years yet. And then on the Cheriton stream at Titchbourne, um, there's a habitat project delivered here. This is actually a, a project that was previously delivered by a company called Aqua Science. It was a mill bypass project, so essentially a new stream cut to get around a mill. It's a great project, but as is sometimes the case, you can deliver a project and then come back to it a few years later and say, actually, it was just missing a little bit of structure. Because it was a new channel cut through essentially open fields, and there not being kind of much woody habitat available to naturally fall in and diversify the conditions there, there was essentially that component of the habitat missing. So again, working with lots of volunteers, lots of elbow grease. This was really a project about just adding icing on the cake, really, of an existing project, but reintroducing that kind of structure and diversity um, to that channel. Moving into 2023, just one project for 2023. We had a turnover of staff. So Morag, who was leading these projects for us, left to move to the Environment Agency, and we had a chap named Darren who came in and took over from Morag. But it's often the case, there's never a good time for these things to happen. But with a project like this, sometimes a few weeks delay is as good as a year's delay because of the sort of deadlines we're trying to work to, the ecological windows we're trying to work around. So the project delivered that year was essentially an extension of the Abbot Sand project at downstream at Little. And again, great fun, volunteers, lots of elbow grease, lots of stuff with hand tools, but also introducing a bit of gravel to create more of a toe along, again, one of these hard engineered sort of garden revetments. And that's just to reintroduce that marginal habitat, that structure where marginal plants can grow. It's also another really important fish habitat. The shallows at the edge of the river in amongst the gravel. It's a really important place for fry, for minnows, for small fish to evade predators. And it's actually something we have very little of in our chalk streams. A lot of our chalk streams have been quite heavily modified and engineered. They're kind of cut into a kind of box shape. And so not having that sloping channel margin, it means that you're missing quite an important component of the ecosystem. Um, but I think great turnout again, really good work from the Watercress and Winterbournes volunteers. Really grateful. Moving into 2024, we had a bit more of a bumpy year, I suppose. Um, we had a project, another one on the Peel Hill Brook. What was great about this is that what we've been trying to do with a lot of these projects is trying to sort of bump projects end to end where we can. So this actually extends down from the Cottage on the Green project. This is at the Hawk Inn, and had a section of river here where at particularly during lower flows, very over wide, very uniform habitat, quite eroded on the pub garden side. Again, people and dogs accessing the river. Chalk streams are uh, they're very attractive places to visit. We don't want to stop people going in them, but one of the problems we have with chalk streams is that access is so limited that where people can access the river, you quite often have large numbers concentrated in one place and end up with erosion and some sediment problems that then arise from that and some loss of marginal habitat. So a combination of techniques here, patching up some of the eroded bays in some places with woody material. We brought in some hazel bundles to do some of this work, and where you've got existing reed beds, what you can often do is just introduce that coarse woody habitat that's just going to act like a bit of a sediment trap, and it will trap the seed bank that's washing down the river, and you'll just find that the reed beds will kind of encroach into it and it will very quickly develop into a reed bed. And then in places like we've done elsewhere, introduce a kind of sloping gravel margin somewhere where people can access the river without causing any more damage to the river bank. Something that will over time blend in and start to look really natural, and you shouldn't know that it was ever put in there, but it's going to resist that footfall and mean that people can access the chalk streams without worrying too much about any resulting damage. Also, just hinging in where we could some bits of live willow and securing that. I think wherever we can, the best habitat we can replicate really is trees falling into rivers, and it's great to be putting wood into these rivers in all shapes and forms. It's always good habitat for invertebrates. It's always good habitat for fish, but every step away we get from the natural habitat of a tree's just fallen in the river, the less naturalistic it is, you see a reduction in the habitat benefits of that. So wherever we can, just essentially lay over some living tree limbs and just let them to continue to grow in the channel. That's where we tend to get the best results. Slightly larger scale project. This is on the Bourne Rivulet at Chapmansford Farm. This is it's actually a very famous section of chalk stream. So if anyone's ever read Plunkett Green's book, Where the Bright Waters Meet, well, this is where the bright waters meet. So this is the uh, two arms of the Bourne Rivulet downstream of what's now the Watercress cress farm and salad watching plant, but also where just downstream of the iconic viaduct there, two channels meet. You see sort of left-handed the picture here. That channel there, very good in-stream habitat. Considering how straight that channel is, it's surprisingly good in-stream habitat, and that's because there's actually a very good gradient there, and that's partially because that channel has been straightened. When you straighten the channel, you essentially make it shorter and you make it steeper. And having a bit of gradient in a chalk stream, that they are quite low gradient systems, means you get quite energized flows, and that actually means that you do maintain quite healthy habitat. You get quite nice clean gravels. However, in this case, um, very, very little marginal habitat, particularly on the right hand bank, so which would be the left hand side of this picture, but the right hand if you were looking downstream. Actually, a very steep bank, partially because that bank is formed of gravels that have previously been dredged out of the river there. So, couple of objectives in this project. One was to try and regrade that very steep bank in places, but also to try and address the straightness of the channel and introduce some diversity where we could. Um, One of the challenges with this project was that the left-hand bank, where there is some good marginal habitat, um, at the time of delivering the project, was thriving with water voles, and we don't want to disturb the water voles, and we can't really go around reshaping that channel whilst they're there. So instead, what we um, looked to do was to create a project where we push the river out in places on the side that we could work on, because that bank was built out of dredgings. It was just a load of gravel, which means A, it's great for reshaping, and B, the water voles aren't in there because it's just a load of gravel. And to try and push that over towards the softer margins where the water voles are, and hopefully just let some morphology occur over a number of years, that means this will start to develop into more of a meandering section of river. So we're really relying on natural processes happening. This was another project delivered by the Wild Trout Trust and a team that they assembled. Nick Lawrence at WTT is he loves to kind of really push things as far as he can, and he used to actually be the river keeper on this section of river, so he's got good relationships with the landowners here and with the stakeholders, and so knew how kind of far he could push things. So it meant that actually that there was some quite significant reshaping of the channel done, and some quite significant woody habitat introductions here. So um, I suppose aiming for something that's as natural as possible, really, is what Nick went for here. So the woody habitat features here, much more kind of randomized. Um, the flood risk was minimal, so actually looking to see, well, let's just put some trees in the river and just let nature take its course, get some scour flowing over and under those features. Let's see if we can uproot some trees and lay them in, um, with the whole root ball through here. Interestingly, uh, a few years ago, there was actually a tornado that went through this valley. We don't get tornadoes very often in this country, but there was one, and it went down through the Bourne Valley, and it uprooted some trees, and we had some features just like this occurring naturally in the river. So it was great to be able to sort of replicate that and say, well, look, we know it naturally happened. One of the questions we do ask ourselves as a team is what would a storm do? It's a great way to kind of approach these sort of projects. And if we want to get natural processes happening in these rivers, we need to start with something that is that we're mimicking something that occurs as a natural process. And um, the end result, you can see actually very quickly a more meandering shape starting to form um, in the river here. So that's been a great project. University of Southampton have taken some various um, drone flights over this site, both before and afterwards, with all kinds of gadgets attached that they're going to be doing some monitoring with. I think they're looking at things like trying to detect changes in vegetation using infrared sensors, things like that. Going back onto the Anton, just let me get this right, upstream, I think, of uh, the Charlton project. There's the stream where it flows through Anton Lakes. In places, the river here is very deep. In places, it's quite shallow. Got a good variation in depth, but very, very uniform habitat conditions. So it's long sections of river here that are all essentially one type of habitat. And there is no bad type of habitat necessarily. It's diversity is key. Niches for species, really. That's what we're looking for. So if you've got a habitat that is very uniform, if it's all one type of habitat, it's going to be inhabited by one specific community of wildlife. So Another great opportunity for volunteers. In these photographs, anytime you see an orange helmet, that's one of our Watercress and Winterbournes volunteers. The white helmets are normally someone from my team. Lots of work getting some light into the channel in some places and pulling lots of woody habitat features around, pinning that in, creating that structure, that diversity, getting that flow deflection back into the channel, getting some of that localized changes in morphology, improved spawning habitat. Um, Again, good for bugs and fish and birds and everything. Also, part of this project, we addressed another sediment issue. So got some gravel delivered to the site. In this case, rather than flint, we normally work with flint because that's the I suppose the native geology gravel that you'll find in chalk streams. But it's not always ideal for the hooves of livestock. So in this case, you've got crushed limestone and use that to reinforce a ford that's used by cattle to move, and that just prevents the poaching of the banks, and that helps to significantly reduce the sediment going into the river at those locations, and that's worked really nicely. Another sediment project, very small scale project here, but sediment ingress into chalk streams, it really is death by 1,000 cuts, and to fix that, you do need 1,000 small sticking plasters. And so these sort of small sticking plaster projects are actually really important. So got a kind of sediment trap, or at least some where a ditch connects to the stream. It gets, I think, cleared out regularly by I think by county highways or by um, local volunteers. But actually, when that happens, what you tend to get is that it gets cleared out and then it just becomes a direct conduit and silt just runs straight in. So um, I I must admit, I actually forget whether this is something we created or something we just repaired that was already there. But it's just a very, very simple solution of some oak timber boards secured across the ditch. That just means that sediment is trapped there, and that can be easily removed. And as long as it's regularly maintained, it will trap quite a significant amount of silt and prevent that from flowing into the stream. So sometimes some of these really basic interventions, this is just what we need. The big challenge, of course, with sediment trapping like this, particularly if it's alongside a road, is someone's got to maintain it. Someone's got to be responsible for looking after this long term. And if anyone listening is familiar, um, there is a notorious intervention that was done a bit like this on a section of the Bourne rivulet where um, once it filled up with silt, uh, nobody wanted to take responsibility for emptying it, and so it basically stopped working. Part of that problem is because if it's road runoff, it's technically contaminated waste. You're going to have all kinds of hydrocarbons and heavy metals and all sorts of things in there, and so really it's got to go to landfill. So unless you can get it onto the maintenance of um, the local authority, or you have someone nearby that's willing to do that and do something with what's excavated, it's actually quite a challenge to get many of these projects delivered, and we haven't yet got all the projects delivered we wanted to with these sort of small scale interventions. So moving into this year, we've started off the year. This is back on the Cheriton stream, the Cheriton mill beat. I think this is a project that sort of ties in with a white-clawed crayfish project that Ben Rushbrook at the Wildlife Trust is running with. And in order to have some good crayfish habitat, you need to have good habitat for everything else. So usual problems. We've got, again, very silty conditions. You can see by the tree growth there. This is a picture taken in the winter, but in summer you've got this uniform dense canopy of leaves overshading the channel. So you've got not a lot of river plants growing, and of course it's the plants growing in the chalk streams. It's the ranunculus and the starwort community that really is the powerhouse of these ecosystems. And in some places, we don't have enough of that growing. And one of the other things that you don't have when you don't have good macrophyte river plant communities flourishing in a chalk stream is that actually flows don't hold up so well during the summer. And ranunculus especially is actually quite good at keeping the riverbed clean, the way that it grows, the way that flow moves around it. So first job here was to get some light into the river. Time of year we were working, we haven't actually put anything in the river there. I think that we're still hoping to, but working sort of still very early in the year. We're sort of still within the salmonid spawning season, really. So you don't want to be disturbing the riverbed. But again, lots of orange hats, lots of volunteers, and some really good work opening up the channel to a bit more sunlight. Over to the Candover Brook. This is actually a project that started in, I think, 2021, but I've listed it as a 2025 project because it's an ongoing project. So whereas a lot of our projects have been sort of interventions undertaken all at once, essentially an equal and opposite violent act to the violent act that initially degraded the chalk stream habitat. Often we are seeking to undo some kind of engineering or channel modifications made in the past. In this case, this is really more about management around the river, so particularly with livestock grazing. So you can see here an area where cattle go down to the river, very, very poached. So like we've done elsewhere, bringing in some gravel and creating some fords as the first stage of this to try and halt that sediment ingress. But then actually where there's been some heavy grazing, this field here had horses in it for a long time. And horses, particularly, they're quite large. They do tend to compact the soil. The way that they graze, if you think about horses' teeth, they're all incisors. They're a nibbling animal. And one of the best ways to kind of undo the sort of intensive grazing and soil compaction you can have from having horses in the field for a long time is to instead try and graze it back into a better condition. So this project involved fencing off a section of the river and the meadow around it, and bringing in initially some dexters. So these are very small, very light cattle. And cattle, they think about how cows eat. They stick out their tongues and they actually tear up the grass. So what they're doing is opening up patches of soil and exposing the soil bank that was under the kind of monoculture of grass, and doing so without trampling the soil too much. And as long as you're careful about the timings of when you have them in, they can actually accelerate the recovery of a much more diverse habitat, particularly if it's sort of a floodplain meadow where you have got the kind of washing in of seed bank from the river, and you've got a nice kind of gradient of saturation in the soil. So you should have a good diverse habitat for a good range of wetland and semi-wet and terrestrial plants to come up through. Now, one of the problems we had with this project, and it's been a great lesson to learn, is this property here. The gates for this fence line were right in the view from that lounge window. And in first attempt of this, the gates were just simple steel 5-bar gates. We didn't think that would be a problem because that's what is being used right, right next door. If the picture I showed you a moment ago, steel gates being used there actually as part of cattle drinks. But we hadn't quite considered just how upset the landowner there would get with this. And actually, we had some quite significant stakeholder engagement to do with this project, and it actually resulted in one of the fords being moved in the end, and also with the gates being replaced with wooden gates. So this project's still ongoing. Unfortunately, the Dexters couldn't stay in the field for very long. This chap here started getting very excited when in the field next door a herd of heifers came in, and he had to be removed. So there's been an ongoing kind of challenge in trying to find a new grazier. We've undertaken some manual hay cuts, hopefully timed at the right time of year to kind of replicate that. We've had a brief period of being grazed down by sheep. All of that will do the same thing in the long run as having some light cattle in there. But the aspiration is to get some light cattle back in. Possibly we'll be getting in some belted Galloways. That they're not quite as small as Dexters, but I would say they're probably the next best thing. So that's an ongoing project, and we're going to keep managing that one up to the end of the program. So looking forward to projects we're aiming to deliver this year. So perhaps one of the biggest is up at Hinton Ampner, National Trust property. This pond here is known as the source of the River Itchen. So there's a small kind of impoundment that means that the springs there fill this area up. It becomes a pond, and then it overflows and spills under the road through a little culvert. But of course, as is often the case with so many rivers, what people call the source of the river and what actually is the source of the river are completely different things, because this is quite a significant distance upstream of the supposed source of the River Itchen. And of course, the sources of our chalk streams are Winterbournes. So depending on how wet the year has been, where the actual source of the river is tends to change. Now, one of the problems that have occurred with this section of Winterbourne is that actually in high flows, the water draining down through the fields, through that Winterbourne, enters a ditch which runs alongside a public footpath. And then it flows through a tiny culvert into the pond area that people refer to as the source of the Itchen. And that very regularly gets blocked, or in high flow years, just overloaded. And what then tends to happen is that water has nowhere to go, and it backs out onto the road, and it starts running down the road, and then we start getting sediment problems running into the River Itchen downstream. So this has been a real priority for the local community here. So people have been very animated about this for a number of years, trying to solve this problem. So what we're aiming to do here is, first of all, to block a field drain that diverts flow from the top of that Winterbourne straight into the ditch. and instead let that run through an area that the National Trust has actually previously widened out to kind of potential sort of flood storage area. And then also to remove that culvert that runs from the ditch to the pond and instead open that up as a stream. And that will mean that we're not relying on that tiny capacity pipe, that actually high flows mean that can spill out into the floodplain around it before it reaches the pond. And that should mean that it's not running straight down the road. Downstream of the pond there's a section of Winterbourne which has had your sort of classic 20th century land drainage treatment. It's been widened. The banks have been bunded up, and it's now quite disconnected from the floodplain and in places very, very wide. Getting again marginal plants growing in the middle of the channel, and it's particularly in low flows, just not a very good habitat. And obviously, it being a winterbourne for a significant portion of the year, it does have quite low flows. So projects planned here to reshape that channel, to build out the existing banks, make use of the material in those bunds, grade it down, and create a narrower, more sinuous channel that's going to retain good flows, good flow conditions through a wider range of flows in the Winterbourne. And also, just take out some of these humps, these bunds that are actually disconnecting the river from the floodplain, and that will significantly increase the marginal habitat. It'll give us that nice successional habitat from the kind of herbaceous plants that really like being down in very saturated conditions, right up through the bank to the more terrestrial plants. And of course, it being one of our projects, we're going to chuck some trees in, because we very rarely deliver a project these days without chucking some trees in the river. So that's to come, hopefully this autumn. Another project that we're quite excited about, actually, this is Wesley Farm Shop. This cress bed is redundant. It's never been particularly great for growing cress, because it tends to get ingress from the stream. When that happens, it's essentially contaminated and you can't sell it as food. This is essentially fed from a series of artesian wells. There is this kind of aging brickwork that acts as an aqueduct, essentially moves that water along the top of the cress beds, and then it's drained through those cress beds. But that's starting to crumble. The wells themselves are still flowing, so there is still a lot of just direct spring water going into these cress beds. And what we're hoping to do is to actually reshape this into a wetland habitat. Now, what's quite fortunate about this is that quite often cress beds are essentially big concrete slabs with some imported like pea shingle on top. But actually, in this case, this cress bed was constructed just by digging away the layers of topsoil until the natural gravel seam of the valley was reached, and then it was just placed on top of that. So we've had some digs around in here, and this is just floodplain gravel under there. So we can actually completely reshape this into a nice kind of wetland habitat. We might see if we can make a little stream flowing through it as well. The owner of the farm shop's quite keen for it to be a kind of a nice, almost like a small tourist attraction, I suppose. Just something really nice for people to come and see. And that's going to have some really great biodiversity benefits. This was just going to, I think, be a really nice end to Watercress and Winterbournes, because this is a watercress site that will be restoring into more of a Winterbourne habitat. So really excited about that one. For me, the best thing about it is that it's not technically a watercourse. It's not a river. It's not an ordinary watercourse, which are ditches and small rivers. It's not a change of use, so it doesn't require planning permission or permits from the Environment Agency or a ordinary watercourse consent from the local authority. So actually, very, very rare we get a project like this where we can go and do something without having to spend a year pulling together reams of paperwork for it. So really excited about this one. We can get really creative, get loads of volunteers involved and do some planting. So I'm really looking forward to that project. And then hopefully what could be the flagship of the Watercress and Winterbournes program. So back to the Bourne Rivulet, back to St Mary Bourne. This is immediately downstream of um, the project where we were sort of softening the stream running along the back of those houses with those hard revetments, and it will essentially link that to the project at Chapman's Ford Farm. So again, gives us that opportunity for that continuous line of restoration. The river here is it's bunded, disconnected from the floodplain. This is it in kind of flood conditions, and you can see that actually this is where the floodplain has some water in it. And the river's been completely moved. This is not the natural course of the river at all. It's also got a couple of these old sort of relic sluice structures in it. Now, what tends to happen is that being a winterbourne, as this dries, we get fish trapped in here, and we do sometimes get fish kill events. You get trout that get stuck in pools and die. What we're planning to do, so the brown line here is this is the existing course of the river. We're aiming to reconnect this. This is the historic course of the river here. This is the Paleo channel. We want to put the stream back into its historic course, fill in the old course. That gets us past these two structures. That significantly improves fish passage. And it also means that we get a really well connected project. So connected to the floodplain. So as well as being a river restoration project, it's a floodplain restoration project as well. This is a real focal point for the local community. There's real kind of excitement that this could be somewhere that will have some good sort of public access as well, at least some permissive access. So this is an opportunity for us to do a full winterbourne restoration with floodplain benefits, with great biodiversity benefits, with great local community benefits. So we're this is currently going in for consent with the Environment Agency, and we're hoping we get that back in time to be able to deliver this. So there are some other projects we are hoping to deliver this year, but we do have a significant challenge this year, something we haven't had before. So I've been doing this work for 17 or 18 years now. I've never had this before, but the Environment Agency, in its infinite wisdom, has decided that the permitting system that we use to get consent to deliver these projects, they've decided to move that from a local area team to a national team, and it has failed spectacularly. So used to be when I started doing this work, you were guaranteed a turnaround of these permits in 8 weeks. If they weren't able to get that turned around in 8 weeks, you were actually presumed to consent. That changed in 2015, I think, to a slightly more complicated system, but a system that still worked. And they've now moved it to a national system, and we've got things that we put in April that haven't yet even been assigned an officer. So I've never been in the position where we don't know whether we'll actually get consent to deliver these projects. So it would be a real shame to get to the end of the Watercress and Winterbournes program and not to be able to deliver these sort of exciting projects. you could speak to people in the Environment Agency locally, they are as upset and angry about it as everyone else. So, your local EA officers are very frustrated with this as well. It's not their fault. They've been really supportive of all this work. So we'll just see what happens, is all we can say. We're gonna try our best. We're gonna rely, as we often do, on a bit of eco karma and momentum, and just push through and hope we get there. And I just wanted to finish up with a little tribute to Dr. Morag Sterling Moggs, who was the project officer for um, most of these projects. Morag sadly passed away just a few weeks ago after a very short battle with cancer, and we're going to really miss her. She did a great job. So I just wanted to drop in a little tribute there. But yeah, thank you.